remind me of the Babe. What Babe? The Babe with the power. What power? The power of voodoo? Hoodoo? Do what? Remind me of the Babe. I saw my baby crying. Wait, what do you mean that's not the right labyrinth? Oh, damn it. Hello, interwebs! I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of I think this is the 8th episode of Star Trek Discovery's 5th and final season. This one titled Labyrinths, and sadly, does not mean that we get a David Bowie cameo in this episode. And, you know, David Bowie just feels like he'd be a perfect fit for Star Trek, especially Star Trek Discovery, considering how queer it is. So, like, come on, bring him back from the dead. That's, like, the whole point of this season, right? It's what we're doing with other characters or bringing people back from the dead. Why not David Bowie? That's how fiction works. They can bring back real-life people. Anyways, we're not talking about Star Wars and their necromantic AI nonsense that they do over there. Let's talk about Star Trek and this episode. As per usual, I will be staying spoiler-free for the most part and then get into full spoilers with a warning in the back half of this review. Before we get started, though, just being on this episode spoiler-free, I will say this was a solid episode, but not really a fantastic one. This one has a really fun premise, especially when you start to get into the clue of it all. As we've been seeing the rest of this season, this is another sort of scavenger hunt test that the characters have to go on, specifically Burnham in this episode, and the concept for that test I found to be really, really cool just on a visual level. I mean, it's no spoiler to say that labyrinths kind of play into this episode just given the title, and I always find a good like labyrinth mystery psychological thing to be really fascinating. I think one of my personal favorites to call out would be the Court of Owls storyline from the Batman comic book run. If you've ever read that, like that has a really cool psychological labyrinth story that I think they fully utilize some of the like cool ways to do a labyrinth in that comic book run. Not necessarily the video game or the animated movie that sort of based on the Court of Owls stuff. That had its own issues, but the comic book run did a great job with it. And Star Trek Discovery, I think, kind of wants to go in that same angle with using a labyrinth as sort of a metaphor to discuss the character of Burnham. And they have some fun visuals and play around with it a little bit, but it doesn't really push it as far as I would want it to go. And maybe that's just me being a huge sci-fi nerd. Maybe for someone who's a bit more of a kind of a casual sci-fi enthusiast would be like, this is really cool concept, like a first introduction to something like this would be really, really cool. As someone who's been reading a lot of sci-fi my whole life, this was like fun and decent, but didn't necessarily push the boundary of the concept as much as I would like it to. That being said, though, the way they use it to really analyze Burnham, I really did like. And again, it kind of goes to this overriding theme of this whole season, which is, while they did not know that this was the final season going into filming it, this does feel like a good, I don't want to necessarily say resolution, but sort of retrospective on Burnham and her arc and her character so far. And there's a really good scene towards the end of this episode that I think really hits on just who Burnham is as a character and who she's always been, and like the character arc that she's been on since the pilot. And I hope it kind of signals that as we get into the finale of this season, that the show is going to be able to give her a really good resolution that feels like, oh, this is a good series finale. Again, I really hope and wish Star Trek Discovery could continue beyond this point in whatever form that would be, whether it be sort of like moving on into Starfleet Academy as like a sort of pseudo spin-off continuation, or, you know, it's Star Trek. You're going to see follow-ups in comic books and, you know, novels and stuff like that. So, you know, certainly I hope there's more to go with Burnham's character in whatever form that takes. But I do think that there's a good setup here to give at least a feeling of resolution to Burnham's character in terms of looking at the arc of who she has been over the course of this series. You know, everyone always said that the arc would end with her becoming captain, but that happened at the end of season 3. So this, I think, kind of sets up the underlying thread there in a really fun way. So I did enjoy that element of it. Everything else with this episode really more feels like setup. We get a little bit of some political intrigue with the Breen and Maul in here. We get some stuff with Rayner and Book working with each other that, again, was interesting, but it didn't necessarily knock my socks off and really felt more like it was trying to get us from point A to point B as we lead into the finale. So nothing that was fantastic or amazing on that front, but worked well enough to keep me, you know, pushing forward and feeling that there's a forward thrust to this narrative going into the final few episodes. So, you all right there. The other element of this too, as we sort of set up last episode, was the archive, the sort of library, and I think there's a few moments that they really do take advantage of the sort of library for multiple different species and across the galaxy in a kind of fun way that I did really enjoy. There's an emotional beat in particular with David Ajala, who I think really just nails it, that I really did like. So I think this was a solid episode. It did not take full advantage of the concepts that it was playing with, but did a good job utilizing them to really hone in on Discovery's strength, which has always been its characters, and especially Michael Burnham. And then also we have some other sort of plot threads continuing and just sort of moving the storyline forward as we move into the series' sadly final couple episodes. So yeah, overall solid, if not fantastic episode of Star Trek Discovery. But to talk more about it, I'm going to get into spoilers. So if you have not seen the episode yet, check out your library books and get out here. Or I guess get out of the labyrinth. I guess that would have been a more apropos, spoiler, warning theme. I don't know. Deal with it. I have acne on my face. I've been dealing with a lot of stuff. I'm anxious on camera today. Just roll with me. All right, let's talk spoilers. I'm going to try and break this up a little bit into separate storylines because they kind of all work separately from each other. So to start off, we have Maul on the Breen ship kind of dealing with the Primarch. And some interesting stuff here where we have Maul basically essentially setting up a coup of the Primarch here. And it's, again, as I was talking about in the spoiler-free section, not necessarily, breaking any boundaries in terms of, instilling, different factions within the Breen and sort of building it up. It doesn't knock my socks off, but it does a decent enough job within this episode to set that off and pay it off in a decent enough way that it felt believable. I mean, we have here the Primarch sort of trying to make a martyr of Locke, and then Maul kind of stepping in for a minute to sort of utilize that, either intentionally or not, to place herself as this figure next to Locke, who is more closely aligned with his actual views and belief, running counter a little bit to the Primarch at start. So kind of setting herself up as this figurehead and symbol that she then sort of manipulates later on. And I did love seeing that and that sort of tension with the Primarch here that we got built up. And that only gets exacerbated throughout the episode as, the Primarch shows up at the archive and sort of demands the clue and even threatens to destroy the archive when there's actually a lot of Breen artifacts there that are important to the Breen, and the Breen sort of holding history is very important to them. Their cultural identity very important, very much a thing for very nationalistic, tribalistic cultures. They would sort of have that. I mean, all cultures to a degree have that sort of respect for their past, but very much in a more nationalistic way kind of fits the Breen to a degree here. And again, Maul sort of saying, this guy's out for himself. He does not care about those things. He just wants to get what he wants. Maybe you should actually, have somebody who does actually care about that, and setting up that coup that eventually does pay off when, he says that he's going to blow things up. He doesn't care about Locke. He just wants things for himself. And it pays off effectively. And so all those beats are hit. I think what makes it not particularly work for me in the long run is it kind of is all set up and paid off in this episode, and while we have had, vignettes with the Breen, such as Maul and Locke's backstory in the past few episodes, we haven't really had a chance to develop the different factions and sides within the Breen culture to really make it feel like there's a lot of different moving pieces and complexities going on here with the Primarch. It just sort of all gets brought up and paid off within this episode, and we get a little allusions to different viewpoints, like with the lieutenant who eventually does the coup for Maul at the end there. There's some really great acting, I should say, by that character, in the sense that, all we get is a mask with that character and some physicality, and you do read within the physicality of that character that he does seem to have some hesitation when it comes to following the Primarch's more authoritarian viewpoint and self-centered viewpoint. So some decent setup there, but I would have liked to get maybe a little bit more sense of the Breen factions, different sides of the Breen factions. There was ample opportunity for that, I think, in earlier episodes when we got to see Maul and Locke's backstory, but it didn't really take full advantage of it. So it's just one of those things where, Star Trek Discovery is, I think, smartly and interestingly trying to develop the Breen, but because the Breen as a species within the Star Trek mythos has always been kind of a mystery to a degree, especially in Deep Space Nine. They don't have as many tools to play with and pull from here that I think leaves this feeling a little bit flatter than it ultimately could have. Still decent and good, and again sets up the storyline for the next 2 episodes with Maul kind of having a sort of nominal place in the leadership of the Breen going forward, which is an interesting setup for her, but makes this episode a little bit feel like more like, okay, this is decent, it's good, but it doesn't pay off all the way. We also do have our characters showing up at the Badlands, of course, an iconic Star Trek location, and going into it to reach the archive. And again, this is kind of fun. It was a little bit of a light action sequence. I didn't necessarily need it, whatever, but it was like, oh, fun, we gotta trust her, turn off our engines, that sort of thing. But then it does lead to Burnham going on to the archive and falling into the labyrinth of the mind that we get set up here. And this is what I was talking about in my spoiler-free section, where the concept was interesting, and I don't think they fully utilized it, but still did a decent job with it, which I loved the set for the archive. Like this giant library, like, oh my gosh, my dream place. I would love to just be there for forever and just explore an archive like that. Very much felt like the what was it? The Infinite Library sort of vibe from I'm blanking on it. What is it? The library where there's like every single book ever that could possibly exist, including every book with like 1 misspelling on page 10, 1 misspelling on page 2, 3 misspellings on page 3, 1 book that's just all the letter A and 1 letter B. I forget I'm blanking on what that's called, but that famous story of the Infinite Library. This kind of gave that same vibe, and even more so when Burnham went into the Mind Palace of the test. And I did really love the concept of Burnham having to figure out what the test is. She knows what the objective is, but what is the test? What are they trying to figure out? And this sort of mind version of Book, who, by the way, his fit was amazing. I loved that outfit on David Ajala. It looked very fun. And Burnham kind of trying to figure out, like, oh, I focus on the mission. That there's going to be an archive. Like, here, that's got to be the test. Oh, I guess that's not it. Maybe it's I have to figure a way out. Oh, that's not the test either. And it going to this mindset with Burnham that we get set up at the top of the episode, which is she's so focused on the mission that, she does care about someone like Book, but, she tends to be more focused on the mission first. And I think that emotionally works very well, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but I don't know, there's just an element of me, like, I love Labyrinths. I love weird, messed up mind gamey sort of stuff, and like locations that don't make entire physical sense. Like you could do weird stuff with that kind of space. And this episode doesn't really take advantage of that fully. And it feels like, oh man, you have all this budget, you have this cool set and cool setup, and you don't really take full advantage of some of the visual elements you could do with that, especially in terms of some of the concepts you're playing with. Felt a little bit disappointing, but again, it's one of those things where I have to kind of measure it where it's I know I am someone who reads a crap ton of science fiction, a crap ton of like really, deep science fiction. So some of these concepts are, kind of basic for me in terms of it. But for someone else who might be, getting into Star Trek Discovery, who might be discovering science fiction where, Star Trek's much more of a mainstream style show, than some of the stuff that I read, this might be the first time encountering it or one of the best versions of it they encountered. So, I can see this being, solid. It definitely doesn't like make me upset, but it feels like, oh man, you could have pushed it a little bit further and would have been cooler. But I certainly don't think it's badly done. Just could have been pushed a little bit further. That said, I do really, really like, as I said, the way they discuss Burnham here, because Burnham has always been a character from episode 1 who has been driven often by anxiety and the fear that she is not good enough. And that fear of her not being good enough often is what makes her make impulsive decisions because she wants to follow the mission. She focuses on the mission so much so that it is often to her detriment and blinds her to other things. Excuse me, apologies, I shouldn't say blind, as that's a weird ableist phrase. So apologies that I used that phrase. I'll leave this in because I think, we should be paying attention to that fact that we shouldn't be using that phrase. Something I'm trying to get out of my vernacular. Anywho, apologies to anybody who was offended by that. Anyways, moving on. It does sort of like stop her from being able to see her weaknesses. And I think pulling in this in the final few episodes of the series, I think is a nice way to really feel like there's been a full arc to Burnham's character. Because again, we all thought the show was going to end with Burnham becoming captain. That was going to be the end resolution of her arc, in the sense that, like, she felt like she wasn't good enough. She felt like she had all this anxiety, and, finally she does earn being captain. But she got it in season 3. And I think that was the right call, for numerous different reasons, not the least of which, like, we always have, many characters get to just be captains, but we always have black characters such as Cisco and Burnham having to earn being captain in a way. And whether that, I don't think it's an overt racist intention by the writers or anything, but it is sort of an unfortunate trend. And so I'm glad we've got to see Burnham be the captain of the show. And so doing it this way, where we still feel like she's working on that element of her personality and her fears and her anxieties, even as a captain, I think does a couple things. One, it adds that arc to her character, makes it feel like there's been a through line for her character, and will hopefully get paid off in the next few episodes, where she, focuses on maybe Book over the mission or something like that, or finds a balance between the two. I think that would be a really great way to give resolution to her character over the course of the series. And also, it does something in the sense that it shows that as a captain, she is still imperfect. And figuring out your anxieties and the things that trigger you and set you off, or you fail at sometimes, is a lifelong struggle. And just because you get a leadership position, just because you work through those things enough to be able to be in a leadership position, doesn't mean you still don't struggle with those things, nor does it mean that you're not a good leader. It means that, you're just more aware of them. You're working on them. You're still capable of, balancing these frustrations with yourself, or negative qualities with people around you. Again, what Star Trek Discovery is always about. And so I really do like that element of this for multiple reasons. So on a character level, I thought this worked great. And I liked the fact that this was the test. They said, you need to know yourself before you're able to use a technology like this. Because if you don't know yourself, we don't know if you'll be the person. If you don't know yourself, how do you know you're going to be able to use this technology in the way that it should, even if you have ideal you want to use it in the ideal way. You should go into it with open eyes of yourself and what it could be used for. So I thought that was a really smart test on a character level. So emotionally, character-wise, thought it was fantastic. Visually / conceptually, in terms of a sci-fi fan that I am, not as huge on it, but still worked overall. The rest of this episode, too, there's some, interesting stuff with, Book and Raynor trying to protect Burnham, and that balance, but, like, Book's like, I'm here to protect Burnham, I'm going to focus on her completely, but then Raynor being like, we need to focus on the mission here because, she's going to die either way if we don't really, kill the Breen and get off the ship. And so I thought that was an interesting sort of subtle reversal for Book, where he's almost always, like, on the emotional journey. Here he can't really do that. He has to focus on the bigger picture, whereas Burnham, on the other hand, has to learn to do the opposite. And I found that to be a good balance in between those two characters, and see where their arc's going to be going. So I thought that worked decently well as well, even if it was just a more sort of faster pace, sort of like, oh, we got to deal with this. Raynor getting a couple cool moments here and being in charge and sort of trying to, like, figure out what to do even while Burnham's knocked out. So all of that worked really well for me. The other scene that I thought was fantastic was David Ajala getting to see the world route from Quajon, this last piece of Quajon. What a beautifully acted moment by David Ajala, and him getting to have this moment of seeing this piece of his culture. And I really loved the way the archivist, the Hyrel, I think was her name, characterized how the archives deals with stuff, where she says, like, look, you have a right to it. We want to protect cultures. We've given it a place of honor. Our idea is to preserve as much as we can of cultures that have passed on or have died. But because you are the last living Quajon that we know about, we will happily give this to your stead. We just ask for information on what happened to it. I thought that was a really beautiful way of thinking about libraries and archives. I really did adore that. And also Hyrel was my neurodivergent fave. I adored her just sort of like being like, oh yeah, just come on in. We've got, like, making weird jokes and being slightly off kilter and being like, oh, it's funny, a book's coming to visit me in the archive. Like, just again, very neurodivergent, like, doesn't fully understand how how people interactions and social interactions work. I related very hard. Just like, I'm more here for the books. I thought that was very fun. So that characterization was great. And that scene with David Ajala, just with his him feeling that emotion, and letting it sort of wash over him, seeing this world root, I thought was a beautifully acted scene and one of my favorites of the whole episode, to be quite frank. I also really love the scene with Stamets, Adira, and Jet Reno trying to figure out how to deal with stuff and stop the Breen from getting to the archive, and Adira and Stamets speaking at the same time. Jet Reno's like, I love it when you do that. All right, you do it again. It's fine. That was really adorable, so I loved that sequence. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to call out. I don't really believe so. We kind of end the episode on sort of setup for, again, the next two, where the Breen demand the final clue, or else they'll blow up the archive. Burnham gives them the clue, but also gets the information of where the last location coordinates are, and then makes it look like they have been blown up as a way to, kind of get the Breen off their backs a little bit, and sort of give them maybe a little bit of an edge as they go into finding the clue, or finding where the location of the progenitor tech is, I should say. So all of that was a lot of fun. Again, mostly set up, worked well for me. Didn't knock my socks off, but was still pretty decent. I don't really think there was anything else. We had the coup with Maul. Yeah, overall, I think this was a solid episode, had some great character beats that felt really appropriate for this being a final season, whether they knew it was going to be or not at the time, and also had some cool concepts and ideas that didn't get fully paid off, but were fun, and then some plot threads got moved forward as we finalized this season. So, good episode, not great, but what did you think about it? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below, but beyond all of that, my friends, I hope you live long and prosper.